Have you ever been to a national park? Have you been to Yosemite National Park in California, which is one of the most iconic national parks known around the world as a symbol of protecting nature? If you have been there or if you've heard about Yosemite, you may know a little bit about the standard story of how Yosemite was created as one of the first national parks in the world and how it serves a role for protecting nature from the kind of damage that we can inflict. So the standard story goes that in the late 19th century, environmentalists like John Muir and before him Galen Clark campaigned to protect this area, the Yosemite Valley and the surrounding forests, as a national park. And the idea of a national park is premised on the fact that humans are generally perceived as being bad for the environment. So the idea is to protect and preserve a natural treasure for future generations in perpetuity, which then means that in the definition of a national park, people don't belong in national parks. And that's how the concept is born. John Muir also campaigned strongly to suppress fires. The whole idea that fire is bad for forests and national parks was born around that time. And then for about a century, fires were suppressed in Yosemite National Park. So that's kind of the standard narrative you may be familiar with. How do I become familiar with Yosemite National Park? Well, I'm an ecologist, which means I study how natural environments work, how the relations between other species, their environment works, and also how humans interact with the environment and what impacts we have on other species as well. So I was born in India, and I had only heard and read about Yosemite National Park when I was a college student there. And I was fascinated by the pictures that I saw that Ansel Adams had taken there. And when I moved to the US as a graduate student in California, I was really excited to go to Yosemite. Growing up in post-colonial India, the Yosemite model, which defines a national park as a place where humans do not belong, or humans must be removed from the landscape, that model has been imposed strongly by the government in India. And that's a model that's been applied all over the world. Many people are forcibly removed from their traditional lands after a place is declared as a national park. And this is how the national parks were born in the US as well. So a couple of examples from India. In central India, we have a tiger reserve called Kanha National Park. It's iconic. Millions of people go there every year looking for tigers. But this was also a place that had indigenous populations living there for generations before the park was created for the protection of tigers. And under the national park model, people were removed from there, and they were given alternatives to settle somewhere else. But a few decades later, one of the consequences was that the habitat, which was park-like, so there were trees and open meadows that were good for deer, which are the primary prey for tigers, these meadows started shrinking because it turned out that the meadows had been maintained by grazing from village cattle and others in the past. So when you remove human activity, the forest dynamics changes and you end up with less habitat for the deer which the tiger need. So that's an unintended consequence of simply trying to protect the place. Similarly, another wetland not too far from Taj Mahal, which you may have heard of, there too, creating a national park to protect this World Heritage wetland resulted in a few years in the wetland itself shrinking because human activity had been removed from there along with cattle, which then meant that vegetation was able to grow freely and it started choking the open water, which is what was important for the wetland. So I'd seen this happen almost in real time while I was beginning to study wildlife sciences as a graduate student in India. And it had made me wonder what the point was of creating a national park if both people who lived there as well as the nature that you're trying to protect were harmed by this model of conservation. Is there an alternative to doing this? So when I first visited Yosemite, I started thinking about what was the actual history of this place. So it turns out that indigenous people actually have lived in Yosemite Valley for about 4,000 years at least, probably a lot longer than that. The people who were living in Yosemite in the mid-19th century, before the campaigns to protect it started, were the Awanichi people, who are part of the southern Sierra Miwok tribe. The beauty of the forest, the beauty of the meadows in the valley were maintained by the Awanichi. And one of the ways that they maintained the landscape was using fire. Fire was an important part of their cultural practices, and they used fire as a way to fight natural fires, but also at low intensity the fires keep the landscape looking like this parkland structure. So you have big trees and then grassland meadows underneath them with good views across. That is what John Muir and others had fallen in love with when they first went to the place. It looked so beautiful. But when the Awanichi were removed from the place, they literally burned out the villages where the Awanichi lived and chased them off the land and tried to either herd them into a reservation outside of the park, or a lot of people were simply killed. So people were removed, the national park is created, and it becomes this iconic place. And along with that there's also this idea that fires are not good for forest protection. This is championed by John Muir, and the US Forest Service also continues to do the same practice. So you have almost a century of fires being suppressed in the park. What happens as a consequence is that the forest continues to grow. In this process, in ecology, we call this process of succession. If in a forested area, if there's open space, seeds will fall, trees start growing, and you end up with a denser forest. But what that means in a place like Yosemite is that you're building up a lot of fuel in the valley floor, which is then prone to burning much more intensely when fires do happen. And these fires have become much more frequent. Fires are an annual phenomenon all across the West now, and you have an increasingly prolonged fire season, especially in the context of climate change, when our summers and our seasons are warmer and longer. So in 2013, it's known as the Rim Fire. You had a massive fire that burned thousands of acres in Yosemite, and you could see the smoke from miles outside Yosemite, and you actually had ash raining in the town of Fresno, which is about 30 miles outside the park, which is where I used to live at the time. And I remember, witnessing this fire and thinking about what has caused this. Likewise, in 2021, there were massive fires that actually affected the sequoia groves in Sequoia National Park, which is nearby. So sequoia trees are among the tallest, biggest trees in the world. They are sort of iconic species both in Yosemite National Park and in Sequoia National Park. And in fact, the discovery of these trees by Western environmentalists or people who first came there from outside is what prompted some of the movement for creating this national park. So ecologists start looking at the phenomenon in a more comprehensive way and realize that fire is actually a critical part of this ecosystem. It has a critical role. Many tree species there, including the iconic sequoias, are actually described now as being fire adapted, which means, especially in the early years, fire is useful for clearing some of the underbrush and making space for trees like the sequoias to start growing. And periodic fires help keep the understory relatively open so these slow growing trees can grow, and they are also adapted, so they don't get harmed as much by fires as long as they are low intensity. So in a sense, what's happened is that the landscape management practices that ecologists now advocate have caught up with what the people who lived there were already doing anyway. They had been doing this for generations. They managed to keep Yosemite Valley in this park-like state, which felt pristine to people like John Muir coming from outside. A former student of mine who is from one of the Central California tribes and who now works for the Cal Fire in fighting these fires as well as in reviving some of these cultural fires. So when looking at a picture of Yosemite that I had taken, he said that when I look at this image, I see a landscape struggling through centuries of settler colonial environmental ethos, which has created conditions to kill giant sequoias, one of the largest and most fire-adapted tree species that live for 2,000 years or more. In less than 200 years, the settler colonial environmental ethos has created the conditions to kill stands of trees that have lived for 2,000 plus years and have survived hundreds of fires. Now that really gives you pause to think about what the goal of protecting this place was and what the consequence was in the way that early conservationists went about trying to protect this. In ignoring the history of humans living in this landscape, they created conditions that have now resulted in much more damage to the place that they were trying to protect. We think of national parks as these places that are pristine, that protect wilderness, that protect nature. But if you look at the history of national parks, in the context of the colonial history of the US, you might be justified in thinking of national parks more as colonial crime scenes as places that not only preserve some aspect of the environment, but they're also preserving the history of crimes against indigenous people who were forcibly removed from their ancestral lands. So when I was a student like you and first learning about Yosemite, I had these romantic ideas of what these places are like. And it took me a long time of learning outside just, not just ecology, but from other disciplines and talking to people from other disciplines to understand how complex these systems are. And it took me a long time, but I think you can get a head start because, the future of these places are going to be in the hands of your generation. You have the opportunity to actually start learning about different ways of studying these systems from different disciplinary perspectives in order to get a better understanding of these places and not have to learn through trial and error and making a lot of damage in the process. That's what the history of national parks has been. But if you take a more considered approach, you have the opportunity of actually doing much better than our generation or previous generations have done in protecting nature. And what that means also is that no matter what discipline you go into, you have a role to play in our future management of these complex environmental systems. So it's not just ecologists who are going to be responsible for taking care of nature or the park service, but you could be doing any number of other disciplines and still play a role in both trying to understand how these complex systems work and how we do a better job of managing them for the longer term.